part of a generation of tools. It's really built to make cybersecurity easier. Welcome back to another episode of the MSP Cyber Roundtable. I'm here with Anthony Collette from Loistava Information Security today. We're actually doing something a little special today, and we're going to get more into it in a few minutes. But the essence of it is rather than looking at tomorrow's threats, we're going to be looking backward at all the things we should have learned but maybe didn't. We're going to try to get some lessons we can take into the future today. Anthony, last time you were on, we were talking fortune cookies, which was like really fun. And I got to take some fortune cookies on the road and watch a bunch of people open them. And which was really interesting to see how people react to fortune cookies because, and I had never really thought about it before. Some people are really into them. Some people are like, what's that? And I'm like, what do you mean, what's that? Like,
don't you know what a fortune cookie is?
Yeah, I couldn't even believe it. But anyway, they had cyber fortunes in them, which was great. And that's basically what you're going to be doing today. You're going to be doing some fortune telling.
Yeah, fortune telling looking backward.
So I can't wait to talk more about that. So you're in, I want to say, like, beautiful Northwest. Do I have that right?
Right, the Pacific Northwest. We're close to Seattle. We're in a really pretty city called Bellevue, which is over here by the main Microsoft campus is in Redmond, and we're right next door.
So beautiful weather. I presume the fires didn't no smoke issues to deal with.
Nope, nothing here.
Just beauty, and unlike where I live, not a frozen hellscape. So and you still got spring to look forward to coming soon.
Right. So not bad. I'm not complaining.
We're gonna get into the Victorian internet a little later. And talk about some lessons that we can learn by exploring backward. But before we do that, talk to me about how did you end up even looking into this space? I know, most of the people I talk to, they fall into two categories, right? Their guidance counselor said cyber pays a lot of money, and they said, yeah, I think I could do that. And they went to cyber school, right? Those are the young people these days.
Right.
A slightly older generation of cyber warriors, they have no idea how they ended up in cyber. They fell into it. Like, it's an incident smacked them in the face. Like, a series of unfortunate left turns in their career left them with chasing vulnerabilities or what have you. Right. But your story was a little different. So tell me. I know we've talked about it personally before, but you didn't spend your whole life leading up to cyber, right?
No, not at all. I had no awareness, no pressing interest, and then 10 years ago now. I can't believe it's been 10 years. But in the summer of 2014, we went to see a movie, and there was a preview for an upcoming flick called The Imitation Game with Benedict Cumberbatch in it. Mm-hmm. And I really liked Benedict Cumberbatch, but I had not. The movie, of course, is about Bletchley Park and World War II code breaking, and I knew nothing about that. But in the preview, there was all these videos of spinning wheels and dials and gizmos and wires, and that was really intriguing to me. And I thought, wow, that's really very interesting. And so kind of went down that rabbit hole a little bit to figure out what that was all about. And then along the way, I just noticed that there was a lot of talk about ciphers and breaking ciphers, but very little talk about codes. And they would say, well, there was ciphers, codes, but we won't talk about those. And so just the omission of much information about codes caught my attention. And so I looked into that, and that's really more about language than math. It's really about how you pull language apart. It's sort of like language Legos. How do you pull language apart into pieces and then put it back together again in some creative way
Hmm.
or some effective way? And that really got me interested. And so then, we just looked around at how the world was changing, and I really felt that, cybersecurity was a really important issue. We're becoming more and more reliant on the internet, and got to stay safe online.
So, some of the really geeky colleagues in my network treat like Viennese ciphers like they're playing Sudoku, and they get them. They get the pages out and they write it all out. And did you dig into Cipher World to that extent, or was this more like storybook ciphers?
No, we actually did dig into it. I wanted to understand what the usefulness of any of that old material was. One of the things that really caught my attention was some new information became available about how the NSA explains the evolution of cybersecurity to itself, to an internal audience. That
Oh, that's
material,
interesting.
yeah, that material has only been around for about 15 years, maybe not quite 15.
Uh
And so
huh.
that was very interesting. Like, cybersecurity has evolved and information security has evolved, and you can look in a history book, but how does the NSA explain it from the podium in their own auditorium to their own audience? That really intrigued me. And looking through that, we just noticed some really interesting odd bits that I didn't see anywhere else. And so we thought, why not look at this as a product and see what you can do here? So we have explored it quite extensively.
Yeah,
And
we. It's not the topic of today, but let's just talk about your recent adventures there. So, what was the first one?
the recent adventures with codes and looking at
Oh
those.
no, you had some projects around that, right? So
Yes, we
you
did. We
yeah.
For codes, we looked at codes and we said, now, is there any possibility? Does this have any usefulness in the modern world? And we started looking about that and looking into it. And then we noticed that one cybersecurity company that's fairly well known had filed a patent application for such a reimagined telegraphic code book for modern use.
Hmm.
And so we weren't the only people thinking about it. So
Hmm.
so yes, we looked into that, checked into it, worked through some of the odd bits that came from this new material. One of the top uh, cybersecurity experts at the NSA, in fact, the guy who was in charge of the cryptographic academy there, um, he was the one who said if you design a telegraphic code the right way and use it the right way, you achieve a result similar to the use of one-time pads, which seems kind of odd, but he
Hmm.
would know because he was in charge of all that. So it took some thinking and a little more time to dig into that and to figure out where he was going with that. But anyway, it is possible to create a product that does serve a useful purpose for some set of people. I
So
don't think.
wait, just to slow down for just in one moment. So a one-time pad, um, for anyone that doesn't know, or maybe you've heard the word and you think you know what it means, but it's a perfect cipher
Right.
because it's not crackable. The
Mm-hmm.
idea is for every bit of information you want to encode with the pad, you have a unique piece of randomness that the universe doesn't know about. The world doesn't know about. It's not non-discoverable, and you never reuse any
Mm,
of the randomness. And because you don't
right.
reuse any of the randomness, there's nothing to learn from to crack the cipher.
Right.
Unless you find the one-time pad and steal it, there's no way to crack those ciphers. So that's perfect security. And
Right.
almost no one uses a one-time pad because it's super impractical to like carry around giant books of paper that you have to keep secret.
Right. Right.
Um, but I
One
just
thing
wanted to
was
point.
interesting. One of the interesting issues on that, this new material that was available from the NSA was, for a long time, people only thought there were two kinds of one-time pads, a number version and a letter version. But in this, what the guy, the director of that department was saying was, we've got an almost endless variety of these things. And so here's a few different kinds of one-time pads we use. And so that was interesting that for what the NSA calls their customers, they design and develop all sorts of different uh,
Yep.
uh, implementations of that. But
Yeah.
as he was in this particular instance, he just mentioned that um, if it's well designed, you get a result that's similar, not uncrackable, not unbreakable, but similar, and that was really intriguing. So anyway, we've looked into that. We've built a prototype. We're very interested to see if that is useful in any way. So that's a more recent involvement in codes. We're just trying to understand what the practicalities are.
So, and you've got the fortune cookies. You've got the password creator book that I've seen. Um, you have to get the password dice,
Right.
right? Did I miss anything?
So yeah, so the dice, Castellot dice are those 14 large dice that create the kind of password that one password says is the strongest kind of password. Same kind of password that would be created if you were using the Google built-in password manager to create a
Mm-hmm.
password. And then, like the EFF talks about, so password managers are great for securing your online accounts, but they don't do anything for your endpoints, your phone, your laptop, your iPad. So to secure those, Electronic Frontier Foundation suggests using random phrases diceware basically. And so we looked at diceware, and as consumer product developers, we thought, well, how do you make this more colorful, more interesting? And so we did a prototype to show how you would not change the technology at all, but how you would just make it more interesting and colorful. So that's our version of diceware.
Yeah, and I really like that one. I happen to use myself. I use a memory palace for those in person, passwords that need to be sort of randomish. But describing a meditative technique to password solutions, it's a difficult conversation to have. People
Yeah.
are like, "What do you mean you
What?
meditate your passwords?" Like, you imagine this space in your. Anyway, so we're getting lost here. Uh, let's bring it back in. We so actually, I want to go back to the NSA. So the for a long time, and this was happening on both sides of the pond, right? Because Bletchley Park, the building's all run down and basically a disaster these days.
Yeah.
But until very recently, I believe that's where they were still doing their cryptology training. Um, and here in the U.S., we've got a similar history. Until not too long ago, a lot of that cryptology was super secret.
Yeah.
Um, and there were history books about um, cryptography and cryptology, but it was ancient history basically. And the 20th century, most of the 20th century, that stuff remained secret until basically the 90s. And even then, it took some time for that culture change. And I don't know when that curriculum change happened in the NSA, but it used to be, I mean, you don't talk about crypto was
Right.
like the government's
Yeah.
line.
Yeah.
And then they realized, great, we've raised an entire generation that don't know anything about crypto. Who's going to make our crypto work? So
Exactly.
so they about faced there, but
So the newly available material brings it up to like the 1960s, 1970s. So as far as like to some extent how the NSA talks about it internally.
mhm.
So it's a great and those materials were made available through something like the Freedom of Information Act. It's another program, and so that stuff's available now, and it's kind of interesting to read through. I mean, maybe you have to be a bit of a crypto nerd. I'm not sure, but I mean, I found it interesting.
I in my spare time, which I don't have much of, that stuff's super interesting to me. All right, so let's narrow this down, because like I totally want to get lost in like the crypto of times past, like 1,000 years ago. But I think if we just fast forward to the last couple hundred years into the
Right.
telegraph era, what was really unique about that technical era was it really set the stage for the internet, right? Which
Right.
was real time communication between these distant points. And just like today on the internet, you really had no idea what's on the other side of that wire, right?
Yeah. You hope you're talking to like, a responsible person, but you never know, right?
Yeah, yeah, and there's all sorts of examples of how that's abused today, and we all know them because like everyone's grandma's been scammed. Everyone's been scammed, right? Or at
Right,
least been partway through one.
right.
Um, and we get those messages every single day. But what did this world look like a couple hundred years ago? I'm just going to throw the question prompt up here. I don't know if anyone wants to ask questions about this era, but Anthony has been on a deep history dive here. Where do you want to start your story?
Well, let's put that. We've got that picture of the image of the Victorian Internet book. Yeah, this is a
Yeah.
book
Okay.
from like 20-ish years ago. It was a real big hit when it first came out. It's still very popular. Um, Really, the general gist of this is that this reminds me of Battlestar Galactica because it's all about this has all happened before and it will all
Hmm.
happen again. And so many of the concerns and hacks we're familiar with today, they happened before and more than once, over and over. So this book, I mean, if you were going to like hop in a time machine and go back to a time before any practical use of electricity, like if you think of like 1776 with Benjamin Franklin and Alexander Hamilton, in that period, there's no electric heat, no electric light, there's not electric anything. All, the homes were heated with oil and coal, and
Hmm.
lighting was by candles and oil lamps. And during that period, as far as information, it moved really slowly. It moved from place to place only as fast as like a horse could gallop or a train could barrel down the tracks or a ship could sail. So information, it took like weeks and sometimes a month and a half for information to travel from London to New York back then. And so people understood that there needed to be a better way to move information around more quickly. So there are people all over the world who are experimenting with electricity, trying to figure electricity out. If electricity could somehow accomplish, um, moving information quicker. And so in 1792, there were these two French brothers named Claude and Rene, and they tried some stuff with electricity, but they couldn't figure it out. It's really tricky. And so they started experimenting with sending information at a distance with sound. So they started like banging pots and pans together. This is kind of tricky, it was a little weird, but they started doing that and to experiment with like how far could you send a signal with sound. And they figured out that that didn't work very well because of well, it just
We
couldn't
get
go very
the
far.
the inverse square law with sound.
Right.
It's the same thing that kills us in radio, right? But
Oh, yeah. So
but
they
yeah.
gave up on that, and then they decided, well, what if we made something visual? So what they did was they built these towers with wooden arms on top called optical telegraphs.
Oh wait, we have one of those here. Should I bring
There you
that up?
go. Right. And so inside the tower, in the bottom section, there's two guys operating that optical telegraph, and they put these towers, 5 to 20 miles apart, and they used a code book from the very beginning, and they sent messages down this line of towers. And Napoleon was a really big fan, and they became really popular. And eventually, there were over 1,000 of these optical
It, this
telegraph.
is like this is like a mirror, and it just like flashes, or what's happening in
No,
this
it
thing?
just the arms get positioned in a certain position, and that relates to something in the code book. And in each tower, there's a guy with a telescope looking at the tower behind them. And so the spotter is looking behind them to the previous tower, and the message is there. And so then he tells the other operator in his tower, "Hey, make the same message and send it down the line." So there was something like this in the
So wait, okay, I can't get over the tower thing. Hold on a second. Listen, this was. Is there a flag on the thing or something? Like,
no, those arms bend in certain positions, and
oh,
so they're
really?
movable. They move the arms. There was something a little more sort of like this in the Lord of the Rings movie, where they sent, they lit fire to these towers, and then the lights went down, miles and
Yeah, yeah,
miles
yeah.
apart, and that was the signal. It was a very simple signal. That was like a call to arms, come to our aid. But in this case, they were sending really complex messages down these optical telegraph lines.
Okay,
And
I could vaguely see how this would be definitely a lot faster than a horse,
right.
unquestionably faster than a human,
Yep.
super expensive, and presumably like you couldn't share this entire system. Like it was just like one person's system because I mean, how would you even share? How would you even know who the message was about, right? Like, I
Well, it was owned by the state. So when
yeah,
Napoleon was around, he wouldn't use it for the public. He only allowed use for the state and for the military. So I mean, it
y-
was like a fairly tightly controlled system.
yeah,
But but it was super popular for like 50, 60 years. And I mean, some limitations with it. You know, it only worked during the day because you had
uh
to have
huh,
line of sight and you had to see what was going on. And the signals couldn't go around mountains or anything like that. And in some places in Europe, you can have a lot of mist, which, you know, I don't know, it's
yeah,
not something we deal with much here, but in that time it was an issue. So I mean, like this was really, really popular. But there was, you know, people who took advantage of the system, and there was this famous scandal at the time. These two brothers were government bond traders, and there were, in addition to just the character, you know, regular characters, there were some like functional characters, and including like a backspace keys and other functions like that. And so these two guys conspired with the telegraph operator to put in some extra backspace characters, and that way they could do this and manipulate things, and they could uh, they 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 manipulated the financial markets that way. And at the time,
Oh wait,
uh,
wait, wait. So wait. So sorry, this is such a great story. So this was not just like, hey, like we're being invaded in this direction, or like ship me some more troops or food. This was used for any data that the state thought was important enough to beam by tower. Is that
right,
right?
right, yeah,
And it was these towers were basically moving all day because
yep,
there was information flowing, right?
absolutely, yeah. They spent an enormous fortune to build this thing, and uh, you know, eventually they had 1,000 of these things all over Europe. So it was a huge leap forward. It seems so basic and so rudimentary to us, but at the time it was like a, a huge improvement. But you know, there's always a way to collude with people and, you know, do something screwy. And so these guys figured out, well, hey, let's do this extra backspace. And if we put an extra backspace here, and if we put an extra backspace there, then that means something to the operator that they were colluding with. And they did manage to get themselves into a really big scandal, but they got away with it because at the time there was no law against what they did. And then
Uh-huh.
these guys go on to become these really wealthy casino owners of all things. But
That sort of makes sense.
yeah, right. So
So,
so so there's the system, the optical telegraph, and it's working great. But everyone is still really fixated on the idea of using electricity to do something better.
so wait, what year was that let's call it a hack. I don't know if hack is the right word for that, but what year was that?
So that would have been like the 1790s,
And the
1805.
equivalent of that was like the equivalent of like I guess like racing a commodities exchange to like hack like a stock sale, like the tower equivalent of that or something.
Right. So one of the things that's a little hard to imagine is that because information moves so slowly, there were enormous differences in where information was and wasn't. And so people were looking to find a way to, I can't remember exactly what the term is.
They were arbitraging
Right.
to great outcomes. It sounds like.
Yes, yes. And so we'll see that again here in a little while. But
All
yeah, so
right.
that's back from the 1700s. People were taking advantage of technology, new technology, to do a little scam kind of stuff. But
Okay. So 1790 haven't quite figured out electricity yet in
nope,
terms of communications, but clearly we know there's this thing called electricity.
right,
We think there's promise, and then what?
right. And so people are experimenting with electricity all over the world, but they couldn't get it to travel very far down a wire. There were just issues with how far can you send it. So then, you know, we're in the 1840s, and there's this guy named Samuel Morse, He had a tragedy in his life. His wife, his fairly young wife, died. He was away from home at the time. The news of his wife's death took so long to reach him. By the time he got home, she had already been buried. And this traumatized him for the rest of his life. And he was really focused on the idea of how do you make information move quicker. So you've got Samuel Morse here in the US. This is now in the 1840s. So you got Samuel Morse in the US working through this personal tragedy, really intrigued by this idea of electricity. And then in England, you got a couple guys named Wheatstone and Cook. They're doing the same thing there. So here in the U.S., you've got Samuel Morse, and he's doing some experiments and getting it to work longer. And he convinces the government to do a test line. So the first electric test line is between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore. It's about, I think, 40 miles maybe. And they get it to work, and then the people in England get it to work, and people look at it and say, well, that's really interesting, but nobody cared. So this huge...
Well, because 40 miles is like, so what, right? Like we can get on a horse and be there in an hour, right?
Right, exactly. And they were like, well, this seems to be like a solution looking for a problem. I mean, it just didn't really click with people. And on both sides of the ocean, people did not respond that big. But then, strangely enough, and this sort of mirrors kind of what we experience with social media here, there were some incidents that really caught the public's attention. And it's sort of like their version of the tabloids and social media. Mm-hmm. But the popularity of the Telegraph took a huge leap forward when it was used to announce the birth of Queen Victoria's second child. So it was like
as a PR stunt.
Ooh, that was great. People thought that was amazing, and there was a lot of hoopla made about that. And then,
wait, slow down. So this was like clearly someone like was ready for it, right? And like planned that, and this was like instead of a horse rider, instead of a smoke signal, like because there's a lot of ceremony there, right?
Right.
And no one's allowed onto the estate. So I guess the wire is the safe way to interact. That's interesting, actually.
Yeah, and so that really caught the public's attention, and then all of the royal family went off to one of the castles for an event related to this birth of the second child, and mm-hmm. one of the royals had left their suit back home, and so they used the Telegraph to request to bring the suit back to the castle for this event around the birth of the second child. And that was also reported in the news, and people thought that was just awesome.
This sounds like a setup, Anthony. Like the royal family must have had some pieces of that, of whatever.
Maybe they but that's that's like this like activity around celebrities.
Yeah. Okay.
Made up a technology.
So a really amazing 1840s marketing campaign that we could all learn from, right?
Right.
And it's like actually like super familiar, really, if you think about what's happening these days, right?
Sure.
And then people got excited about this thing, but how did that turn into a business?
Well, yeah. So it caught on really quickly. So in 1846, there was only one telegraph line, and it was only 40 miles long. And 2 years later, there was 2,000 miles of wire strung up in the U.S. And 2 years after that, there was 12,000 miles of telegraph wire operated by 20 different companies. So it just exploded in popularity.
So Western Union presumably was a big buyer, right? Because they were racing around on trains, I presume, with mailbags.
Yep. Yes, Western Union was the biggest and pretty much a monopoly, basically. Not a total monopoly, but an almost monopoly. And Western Union was pretty much it.
Yeah, there was a lot of capital available for that at that time, right?
Yes, there was, because where do you string the wires? Well, the railroads already had railroad right of way where the railroad tracks were, and so it was a natural fit for them to string telegraph wire, right next to the railroad tracks. And the railroads were a big customer of telegraph for the beginning, because in addition to the celebrity gossip, there was also a true crime angle, because at that time, these criminals would rob people on a busy train platform, and then hop on the train and escape that way. And there was no way to get information about who the criminal was.
Not faster than the train they were on, right?
Exactly. So they basically always got away with it. So there were two big networks of these type of pickpocket robbers who got busted by the railroad companies because now they could telegraph ahead and say, hey, this guy who was dressed like this did this, and they would be able to arrest them at the next station.
So one of the earliest, I mean, clearly people were making money on this, right? But one of the earliest social impacts, what you're describing, is actually sort of crime fighting tactics. So
Crime
that's
fighting,
really interesting. Yeah.
right. And so eventually, police departments on both sides of the ocean put together telegraphic code books to send criminal descriptions and information about criminals in a more compressed way over the telegraph. So it became a thing related to law enforcement also. So yeah, the telegraph was the world's first World Wide Web. It was their own version of the internet, and there were a
Now,
lot
people, I guess if you were wealthy, you might have an actual telegraph in your house, but who knows if you'd be able to operate one, right? You'd have to be trained to operate one,
right.
Because they weren't originally something that, I think, sometimes we see these movies about the early 20th century where they actually had ticker tape that would come out of them in an automated fashion, but that was not the way they started, right? So this was like you'd have to be trained to operate these things, I presume.
Right. You had to be trained to operate them, and that created a whole culture that was a lot like the early internet culture. People who, it was a really cool profession to be a telegraph operator, because you got to know things first before anybody else did. So anything interesting that happened in the world, you would know about it. It was also a profession that was open to women because it wasn't terribly strenuous. So that was a part of the culture. And there were quite a few similarities between the telegraph operator culture and some of the early internet crowd.
Yeah, and if we, I know we're not going to go all the way into the digital era, but I imagine that job, the telegraph operator job, not only did it open that job to women, it created the position called computer, which what used to be a job title, not a thing you buy.
Right, it used to be a person.
So the telegraph network is spanning the world, and then what types of, this is like before there's a transatlantic cable system yet, right?
This was before the ocean cables were put down. There were some echoes of the past that the system's up and running and businesses are using it like crazy, and every business is using it. One of the things they created that was a kind of a sort of a bit of an echo to our time was they created a nickname system. So if you were sending a telegram to a certain business, you would normally include the whole address, like on street and city and state and all that business. Well, they charged per the word. So they came up with a nickname system, and each company got to reserve a special word or phrase as their telegraphic address. And so instead of putting the whole physical address, you can just use that one word or phrase to get it to the company you were sending it to. And there was a central catalog, and this created additional revenue for the post office because there was an annual charge to renew these addresses. I mean, it was a lot like a URL. So
yeah,
I thought
that's really interesting. So was there essentially e-commerce happening in this era? I mean, were people creating, like, basically placing orders by telegraph, and would that go directly to a company that could then fulfill the order?
Oh, exactly. Yeah, there were telegraph. Ford Motor Company had a telegraph code. All of these companies conducted business over the telegraph because it sped things up so fast. And in fact, the people who created the one-time pad in the 1880s, that was one of the largest independent banks. And so you had banks conducting banking business over the internet, over their internet, which was the telegraph, which, I mean, they knew was totally insecure, but they're sending money. So they have to figure out how to how to operate, uh, how to conduct business securely over an insecure network. And so that's what so many of these security issues were. And that was the driving force because there was so much commerce going on.
So you could redirect money until they figured out. I presumably the banks learned real quick on that one.
They sure did.
Um,
So they
learned they learned how to encode that. But I could also imagine my mind's spinning about the ways you could redirect product. You could order things
sure,
to
and there was
an address and then disappear cartloads of goods, and no
yeah,
one would ever get that back, right? No one would ever
yeah.
track that
It
down.
happened. There was a lot of fraud, and that's why these that drove the development, the evolution of these different security systems. So there was like these hacks that were of the optical telegraphs. Those guys who uh, did the extra backspace keys, and then in the 1800s there was a hack where uh, the various different types of people were doing all sorts of crime over the telegraph. And then even in 1903, you're moving into later times where you're talking wireless. There
Mhm.
was Marconi was the guy who was credited with making radio, and he had wireless telegraph, which he was demonstrating. And he said, "Oh yeah, no one can." Basically, he said, "No one can hack into my wireless telegraph. It's not possible." And so he was giving a demonstration to the Royal Society, and somebody totally hacked into his into his system during the demonstration and said some nasty things about him, which were reported in the press. So these kinds of things happen over and over again.
And wireless telegraph, of course, just being, they're going to send this over, the shortwave, I presume.
Yeah, just
Um, ra-
over radio waves.
yeah.
Yep.
So, and until very recently, we still had number stations operating
Yeah. Yeah.
that were still sort of beaming those those numbers around the world by essentially wireless telegraph. So that was what year are we in now, where wireless telegraph was just being carted out onto the stage?
Yeah, so that was demonstrated in 1903
Okay.
by Marconi. And one of the interesting things he did, it was mostly he thought it was for would be a really good fit for shipping, the world of sort of international shipping. And one of the problems they had was that there were like five, six, eight, I think nine different languages that were really very popular in the world of shipping at the time. And so Marconi did this thing where he did this wireless telegraph, but he created multilingual, automatically translating code books. So the same phrases would be in multiple different languages, and the Italians and the French and the Spanish and the English
Hmm.
speaking world could use the same materials.
That's super interesting,
Yeah,
actually.
that worked out really well for them.
So I'm just imagining how that would work, which is you have one set of codes, but the translation book is just in your language, basically.
Correct. Right.
Yeah.
Right. And he was the first person who thought about doing that. And because there was so much of a diversity in language and international shipping, it worked out really well.
Yeah, well, and also in shipping, unlike I imagine terrestrial telegraph, there's a real limited set of things you really need to communicate.
Right. It's
So
pretty
they actually
focused.
could do that, right? Whereas
Right.
if you're just trying to free form language, that would be very challenging.
Very challenging. Yeah. Yep. Exactly. So, so anyway, the concept we were talking about before was taking advantage of information imbalances. So like before, when information was moving really slow, you could have the results of a horse race in one area, but it would take a long time for that information to get to the bookies
Hmm.
in places where that was legal to do that. But if you could game the system somehow, and people did by using some really colorful, interesting approaches, they would game the system and send a message that what was maybe about their scarf or the tartan or the color of their scarf, and that would indicate which horse to place a bet on, and so which was totally illegal. But they did this sort of stuff and tried to get away with it.
Well, and in cyber, there's a concept called a race condition,
Hmm.
um, which is something you have to check for when you're developing a secure system, which is that there's sometimes time can be used against you.
Hmm.
And you have to check for these things, or it will be, essentially.
Right.
And this was the first time people had sort of really had to confront that, which is normally, everyone hold time as a constant, and the amount of time it takes information to travel was sort of a constant, right? And all of a sudden, the speed at which information can travel changed, right? Which, even if you weren't taking advantage of the actual telegraph system, you could use the telegraph system to take advantage of the security of the real world too, I imagine. And that's what you were describing, right? Which is, you had bookmaking, which previously, was more or less predictable, right? But and then the telegraph happened, and all of a sudden, like, it doesn't work anymore, right?
Right. And they tried to make that illegal to do, and all the Western Union offices and other offices were on guard for that. But they would create these seemingly innocent-sounding messages that they'd send over the telegraph, but they had hidden, sort of like steganography. They had hidden, words and phrases or descriptions of a seemingly innocent thing, but that communicated the idea of this is the horse you need to bet on. Place a bet on this one, and then they would clean up because they make a lot of money on that sort of thing. So
Now, I feel like I should have done a little bit of telegraph history research before we jumped into today, but I know you're the expert of the day. So the thing that's always been super interesting to me is when we cross the ocean with these signals, how truly strange that is, really. And we all take it for granted. But well, first of all, the wireless telegraph, did they figure out how to bounce the signals off to Europe? Was that happening
yeah,
wirelessly?
yeah. Eventually
That
they
was
did, but the big push was to put those
the cables.
underground cables, sea cables, and stretch them from coast to coast.
And that's even stranger to me because, honestly, I mean, people just take it for granted because it's been around a long time, but um I literally cannot imagine a cable that long.
I know.
I it's the bottom of the ocean, which is already like, it's like miles deep, right? We're talking 5 miles deep in some places, right? And who knows what's down there? And somehow
Yeah,
they would just stretch this cable across continents, and we all take that for granted because, like, technology does all sorts of, like, difficult to fathom things, and we just sort of, oh, of course you could bend reality to, like, whatever humanity can think up, like, we could just figure out how to do. But this was like the first time there was a real reality bend, right?
yeah.
I
They,
think.
they got the first one, transatlantic cable down, and there was huge celebration. It was like considered this enormous technological accomplishment. Cost a fortune for these companies to get that cable across the ocean. They had all these parties, and it was all a lot of media excitement about it, and like the Queen transmitted a message to the U.S. president. It was a really big deal, and 1 month later, the thing permanently stopped working.
I did remember that. Did we ever find out why, or sabotage, or bad design, or what?
Probably not sabotage, unlike what we see happening today, which is very much sabotage. But for this first cable, no, it was probably just, they had laid cables in water across lakes and across rivers. They had a lot of experience with that. But it's a long way between the U.S. and Europe. That's a really long way, and it just took them a while to figure out how to make the cable consistently of a high enough quality that it would work. And
Mhm.
there were also some issues with resistance, and they had to figure some of those issues out. But yeah, that was a big accomplishment. But then eventually they figured it out. A few years later, they had specialized boats. They had improved the boats, the ships that were laying the cable. Like, had
Mhm.
improved all the equipment to do that. But yeah, so what we see today is seems like some very intentional
Yeah, and for anyone
severing.
who's not paying attention, we have these cables strung all over the planet, more of them today
Yes.
than ever. And near the shore, they're big, thick things like this. But as soon as you get into the deep waters, they're not that thick because you can't make a 4,000 mile long, like, cable that thick.
No,
So they get quite thin and they're easy to damage. And like honestly, all you got to do is drop an anchor and drag it, right?
exactly,
And you
exactly.
don't even have to do it out in the middle of the ocean. You can just do it like a couple miles offshore. And yeah, we're seeing cable attacks in the last couple of years that I don't recall in living history. I'm not even sure that that's ever happened. Have people ever attacked these cables in the past the way that we're seeing now?
Yes. So
Okay.
this was on the day that World War One was announced. Um, Cables were cut. So it's an old tactic. It's been used before. Um, so yeah, so it's not new. It's just pretty egregious, going
Well, and
on.
we really depend on these things now, and
Exactly. No, we really
you
do.
you can repair them, and there are repair ships, but it takes 2 years to lay a new cable,
Yeah.
and if you need to raise capital for it, longer. So you got to make the cable, you got to lay it, all that stuff. You got to get in line. There's only so many cable ships, so much cable, and it is being cut, and there's people shooting lasers around the planet now too.
Yeah.
But really, our cable system's important because you might think, oh, shooting digital information through the sky with lasers is like, of course, that's going to replace cables, but it's really not.
Mm.
There's limited bandwidth in the sky, unlike a glass cable where it's really a limited resource what we can beam around with lasers. And in addition to that, the sky is vulnerable to all sorts of things.
Mm.
A cable, if no one cuts it intentionally, is really resilient
Yeah.
to pretty much anything that Mother Nature can put out there.
Right.
So it's a little worrying. It's a little worrying that some like really big systems in the world, right, that depend on these things are, um, we haven't heard in the public talks of holding ransom around this, but like the unsaid thing unsaid truth between superpowers is like, we don't have to drop bombs. All we got to do is drag an anchor.
Right. Right. And you're seeing like Finland and Sweden being far more aggressive about seizing the ships that do this, dragging them into their own waters, uh, investigating, boarding the ships, investigating. Both Finland and Sweden have both done this in the past 2 months. So they're getting pretty serious about uh, trying to encourage whoever is doing that to stop doing it.
Now, um, people may not know this, and I'm looking for maybe if there's a telegraph equivalent to this, but in the last several decades, we've had this cable system, and it was copper. And recently, we've pretty much phased copper out. These days, we're all fiber. But whether it's copper or fiber, the U.S. government's been down at the bottom of the ocean tapping these cables.
Right.
So we have the NRO, the National Reconnaissance Office. It's literally in their mission to do this.
Mhm.
They maintain a fleet of submersibles built to do that exact thing.
Right.
And they can literally dock a submarine on the ocean floor, and they pull that cable inside.
Yeah.
They splice it, and all of a sudden that they got a copy of everything in that cable, and they run their own like sort of trunk splice line to wherever they want, and they have
Yep.
a copy of that information. And actually, I'm comfortable talking about that in public because these concepts are a little dated. We've got other ways to steal information these days, and I don't know that that's happening as much as it was happening, say, a couple decades ago. This was sort of like really sophisticated stuff. But um, I mean, was this happening in the Telegraph era? People were tapping
Oh
into
yeah.
cables and just like, I get, is that where the word tap came from? I don't.
Yes, to answer your question, yes, it happened during the telegraph era. It was a real issue during the Civil War because the other side, whichever side you were on, the other side would do their best to gain access to the telegraph line, and it was pretty easy to do. So
Uh-huh.
that was a very common thing there. And so more use of ciphers and codes for the military. That was one of
Hmm.
the issues that that facilitated the evolution of codes and ciphers then for during the Civil War was that the problem was people were tapping the telegraph lines.
Now, this is because they're sitting on the side of the road, and you can just drive up to a
Right,
cable
because
and
it's right there.
strip a little insulator off, and
Just go up that pole. They had people who would climb the poles and just
yep.
physically attach equipment to them, and yeah, it was a thing.
I shared this story when we were in the green room, but I just want to, when I was studying for my cybersecurity credential, there's all sorts of case studies you have to when you're reading textbooks, right? One of them was that these telegraphs into World War One, we had radios. The military had radios. But for security reasons, they would drag telegraph wires out into trenches to secure their orders, so they couldn't be picked up out of the ether, so to speak. This is like trench warfare, super new. They're trying to figure out how to like dispatch and stuff. And I'm sure it was someone in the accounting department asked, "Hey, can we save some money on wire?" And
Both them being counters.
yeah. And they realized they didn't need to drag a pair of wires out to the trench. They could just drag one wire, and then they could stake it into the ground, and the ground would be the return path for the telegraph. But of course, if you're on the other side, all you have to do is stick your own stake in the ground pretty much anywhere, and you'd be able to tap the signal from that telegraph. And I'm wondering. I mean, I know technically how you could do this. We use these concepts even to yank encryption keys out of a computer from 10, 15 feet away. We can do this these days. I'm wondering if people were pulling signals out of these wires without even climbing the pole. Is that something that could be done?
I bet it could. I bet you could like poke a stake into the ground nearby and pick up the
bleed over. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's like an early day version of Tempest. All those issues about the security of moving information through different environments and signals going out far outside of the confines of the equipment that they were meant to stay within. But yeah.
Well, I could just keep talking about this, and it seems like you could too. We're running out of time here. I want to make sure we take a moment to just remind everyone about Loistava. So you are on a little bit of a mission. So we talked about some of your projects, and was the fortune cookies the latest, or we didn't talk about the stickers, right? What other things what do you want to talk about? Tell people about Loistava.
Oh, sure. We really like the idea of using physical products to help people clue into cybersecurity ideas, and so we created this fun cyber fortune cookie project, mostly as a cybersecurity awareness product that businesses could use. So for that, there's the cyber fortune cookies themselves. There's some stickers. There's some enamel pins. It's colorful and interesting and odd, and it attracts people's attention. And then just the experience of opening a fortune cookie with a cyber fortune inside is just kind of something different, kind of interesting. And so these other products that we created were to find ways to make colorful, interesting products that were physical, because from our point of view, physical products and physical teaching aids have always been used to help people understand unfamiliar concepts. And there's a lot about cybersecurity that's not really well understood by the general public yet. So we think there's some opportunity there to help people understand better.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think I have to say that even specialists are not as informed as they should be. Frankly, the world is moving too fast for all of us, so we have to help each other.
Okay, things change.
So, yeah, next week we have security KPIs. We're bringing Garrett Grayjack from UAtest back with Bill Lauterbach, Kashif Mahmood. We're going to be talking about security KPIs. UAtest has this new cyber trust score around personal identities. We're going to be digging into that as well. I can't wait to have that conversation. So come on back, everyone, and join us next week. But until then, thanks for joining us, and like, share, subscribe to us on YouTube or LinkedIn.
Have a great
Thank you,
weekend,
everyone.
everyone.
Yep. Bye.